Yeah, I wanted to get on for a second here and talk about some news that happened last week that sort of got buried in the whole Donald Trump trial because, of course, the media is in full Donald Trump mode, which in one case is understandable because it is a historic trial of a former president of the United States. On the other hand, I think it is a little bit much. But anyway, it was the Harvey Weinstein verdict being flipped by the New York Court of Appeals. I could not believe it when I saw that news. And it's funny, there's a podcast I was listening to during the trial, which I really did not pay that much attention to, because to be quite frank, I had assumed that Harvey Weinstein was guilty. And from what I heard, just sort of paying attention just a little bit, I felt like, okay, I've heard enough. I don't need to hear like every single detail of this case. But there was a podcast that was on at the time that was quite good by two journalists from, I believe, Ireland that I was listening to, and they were reenacting the day's court proceedings and all of this. And I can remember thinking at the time, oh, well, this doesn't really matter because he's going to be found guilty. It's called the Harvey Weinstein Trial Unfiltered. I would highly, highly recommend that because the way that they reported it was pretty blunt in terms of like, they're from another country, the two folks on the podcast, and they have sort of a different, not so biased view of it, whereas American reporting tends to have a lot of advocacy attached to it and opinion attached to it. But at any rate, when that got vacated by or flipped, overturned by the New York Court of Appeals, I immediately went to see who was on the New York Court of Appeals, right? I mean, what is going on here? And turns out it was four women and three men. I think most people might have assumed, well, it must be a bunch of men on there that, no. And they were all picked by Kathy Hochul and Andrew Cuomo. So they're recent. They're recent. Of course, Cuomo had been governor for like 12 years or something. So it makes sense that Cuomo would have had most of those picks. At any rate, I want to talk about it in the terms of two things, sort of where the MeToo movement is and how it might affect another case in the office of the Manhattan DA, which is Alvin Bragg. Remembering that it wasn't Alvin Bragg who prosecuted Harvey Weinstein, it was Cyrus Vance Jr. And so that's important to remember because I think that the way that Bragg will do it, of course, will be different. It's a different office and a different person running the office. But to just sort of go over a few things about Me Too, obviously the Harvey Weinstein case was the premier case in the Me Too movement. And of course, that made a lot of sense. There was a lot of backstory there. The allegations against Weinstein go back literally 3 decades at least. So you had a lot of folks and a lot of women who were saying, look, this guy is obviously problematic. No one is a particular fan of him at all in this particular on this particular subject matter, and I think nor should they be. And so it made sense that this was happening. Effectively, it's a casting couch story, but of course, it's not a casting couch story. It's a sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape story. And so Harvey Weinstein, to me, and one of the reasons I didn't really pay that much attention to the details of the case was, look, this is just a matter of time before they're going to get this guy, particularly in the era of when it was happening and all the reporting around it. And I did read the book She Said by Megan Twohey and Jody Cantor. A very well done book in terms of the depth of their reporting, which was unbelievable. It was sort of, I think it was a 2-year period of reporting. And it was really, really detailed. And so I don't remember in this when exactly I read the book, but I read the book shortly after it came out. I should say I listened to the book. I got the audio version of the book. But to me, that's obviously the marquee Me Too case. And interestingly enough, and I think this is why it relates to Jonathan Majors, is that the case is turning on the question of witnesses that were not the primary plaintiffs in the case. The two primary plaintiffs in the case have sort of complicated stories when it comes to Mr. Weinstein, because what they had was a look, he did this to me, and then they had a further relationship with him after that I think might have been sort of an issue for the jury. Because if you remember, there were a lot of counts against Weinstein, and he was not found guilty on some of the bigger counts. And I suspect the reason for that was because the two main the two main witnesses giving testimony at trial went on for years after to have a consensual situation with Mr. Weinstein. So I think maybe that was one of the contributing factors as to why he was not found guilty on all the counts, which I actually think everybody was sort of expecting. But one of the things that's so interesting about the Weinstein case is that the two folks on the podcast I was listening to from day one were saying, we're going to be surprised if he gets convicted. And I remember thinking, really? I mean, you can be surprised if he gets convicted. And this is what they brought up. They brought up the fact that the Molyneux witnesses that were not specifically related to the charges brought were allowed to talk about prior bad acts. And the thing that the folks on the podcast mentioned is exactly the thing that the New York Court of Appeals flipped the case over. And so it's interesting that that podcast turned out to be right. I disagreed with what they were saying at the time. I found it interesting, but I disagreed with it. But then again, I wasn't really paying pinpoint attention. I was sort of listening to the podcast here and there. But that reminds me of the Jonathan Majors case, because, of course, what happened in his case was there was a Molyneux question. And, of course, they couldn't get the witnesses in court on the stand. Obviously, it was a prior bad act issue. So what happens? They pop up right during the time that the judge is doing some key decision making about how the trial will go forward. They pop up in the New York Times, two women that Jonathan Majors has previously dated. And one of them pops up with an allegation of, in fact, quotes, emotional abuse. And this is not to say that there isn't such a thing as emotional abuse. Of course there is. But what exactly we're talking about is where, we get to the nitty gritty of whether or not that actually matters in this context. And then the other person had a story that involved physicality, but it involved physicality with a backstory that I thought was kind of intriguing, which was, according to the New York Times, Mr. Majors contemplating suicide in some way and her trying to physically stop him. That interpretation, I think, is given to a lot of questions. It's like sort of like, it wasn't a situation where he walks into a room and does an act of abuse on somebody. It's a situation where there's some, circumstances that might have contributed to the physicality. So you needed that, in my view. I wish the two ladies had actually been in court, because it would have been interesting on cross to hear further hear the story. I also think it probably would have prompted Mr. Majors to testify at his trial, which I think he should have done. I think if you can talk on ABC News, you can testify at trial. Like, what is the difference? But I do understand his point that he made on ABC, which was, I couldn't believe it with the evidence, at trial that more evidence had to be presented. I agree with him on that. I don't know what other evidence had to be presented, particularly when you saw Ms. Jabari chasing Mr. Majors down the street. But at any rate, the Me Too part of it to me is what's interesting in the Weinstein case, because there was a feeling at the time when Weinstein was being tried that you didn't really have to have hard evidence. You've got all these ladies testifying, you have the reporting in the background, you have all sorts of things going on. The book had not come out by then, but still, when you look at the depth of information, we don't really need all this stuff. And it turns out that was wrong. And in the next video, I'll go through why that might have been the case.